One of the first buckets that we talked about in the toolkit of Etikang Pilipino is the notion of moral agency, which we will tentatively describe as Pag-uugaling Makatao. The question has to do with what makes any human movement a distinctively human act. In the tradition, the early philosophers discussed the difference between actus hominis and actus humanus. Basically, is every human movement also a human movement? At that time, they were still struggling with the terminology and did not make a very careful distinction until eventually they settled on certain characteristics or qualities of the human action that distinguish it from an automatic, mechanical activity to something that was humanizing, responsible. And they determined that those were conscious acts and free acts. Conscious acts and free acts can be virtual, in other words, existing entirely in one's interiority, or they can be executed. In other words, acted out, become empirical, become part of external reality. Looking at the psychology, as it was understood at the time, of human action, this depended on motive and intention and resulted in foreseen and unforeseen consequences. Today, we don't talk anymore about that particular question because those are considered as settled opinions. Today, the focus has shifted to the notion of attitude, disposition, predisposition, and so forth. And if today you take a closer look at how attitude is defined, you will find competing and rival definitions. Essentially, however, they will recognize that there are at least three elements. There is a cognitive element in attitude, there is an affective element in attitude, and there is a potential behavioral component in attitude. And attitude can sometimes be a synthetic term for the whole of human conduct, distinguished from individual actions. And today, the neuroscience of behavior seeks to understand where behavior originates in the cerebral cortex. What interests us with regard to the Filipino understanding or the Filipino emics of agency are its manifestations in the language or its understandings as conveyed in the language, and they're described as galaw, as the generic term, which can either be kislot, and those are automatic activities that are beyond our control, as when we blink, as when our stomach begins to grumble because of hunger, that we breathe, and so forth. However, they can also become consciously controlled in a general way, and that is what we describe as kilos, an elusive concept in Filipino terminology. There's a third formality of human action, and that is gawa, and that is that type of activity which results in a change in external reality. The question of human freedom is not the one that we pose today. Filipinos, with regard to morality, focus on voluntariness. And that voluntariness can be divided into three dimensions. And that is kusa, which is almost reflex. Kusang loob, which is something that is accepted even if reluctantly faced the first time. And sadya is much more conscious because it is intentional. The phenomenology of loob as bukal ng galaw focuses on certain particular issues. First of all, subjectivity as the source of agency. And then we ask the question of the nature of this subject of action. We find, as revealed in the language, several alternative terms, synonyms, renditions, translations, which move into 6 branches or lexical branchings that can be identified as malay, dama, ugali, isip, bait, at kalooban. There's the question of epistemology, or how to interpret activity. And we find that it is revealed by way of the body, objects, and word expressions. A clearer view into the dynamics of loob can be seen when loob A interacts with loob B, or loob interacts with labas in general. Loob also assumes certain configurations, and within philosophical ethics, what interests us are katauhan and pagkatao. Katauhan translating to generally psychological personality or persona, and pagkatao as your moral character. Human action emerges from a person's within, or loob. Now, galaw, which is said, takes the form of gawa, kilos, at gawi, and become the basis for morally relevant activity. When we think of the body, for example, we see its expressions in dance. We see posture or readiness to do certain things, or simply a position that indicates a certain disposition towards reality and other subjects. The word can be the simple word, but it can be language in general, or more abstractly, communication by way of the word, spoken, written, and other forms. And evidently, we use all kinds of objects in order to indicate our feelings, our sensations, our intentions, and so forth. Generally, when we look at a global picture of how we behave, we find the roots of behavior in certain ideas of the human and the moral with regard to certain decisions that we must make, as dictated or learned from the culture. And that is what enculturation is all about. Enculturation with an E rather than an I, because enculturation is your introduction and assimilation of the values, the principles, the norms, the narratives, and the paradigms of the culture. Enculturation, on the other hand, is much more conscious, and that is a selective reading of what you have been exposed to and have assimilated from culture in order to accept freely and decline others. And that is where the human agent today is being considered. How free are we when we think we are free? Or are we not simply the products as well of our prejudices and of our cultural matrices? And that is where acting, doing, and human conduct become not simply terms, but individual philosophical themes that must be dissected one by one. That, however, is the area of psychology and the behavioral sciences. And basically, there is nothing that they are saying there that has not already been philosophically digested in terms of what is relevant morally, and that is freedom and voluntariness. In terms of freedom, human conduct can be, as we said, kusa, which is spontaneous, kusang loob, voluntary, and sadya, which is intentional. A quick example of the difficulties and the complexities of determining voluntariness may be, for example, bioethics, where a healthcare professional, in particular, say a surgeon, must make a decision with regard to abortion. Is his action something that he wants, something that he resigns himself to, or something that he does because it is part of his convictions? What happens when there is an objection on the part of the patient or on the part of those who care for the patient and act as proxy decision makers? Where do you draw the line between kusang loob and sadya, and therefore establish accountabilities which may even be legal? Sa pamagitan ng mga galaw na nagbubuhat sa loob, nakikilala ang tao ng tao ang sariling katauhan, kung sino siya bilang tao, at nililikha ang sariling pagkatao, kung ano siya naging bilang uri ng tao. So makatuwid hindi magkapareho kung tatanungin natin kung ano ka bilang tao at kung sino ka bilang tao. Because ano is generic, it classifies you as just one more human being among many, while sino distinguishes you because of your decisions and moral activity into a particular type of personality. Katauhan, pagkatao. But it is through human agency, galaw in general, rooted in subjectivity or loob, that the human person, the human being, becomes a person. In other words, he recognizes himself in his or her psychological personality and constructs one's moral character. One is a given. The other is something that we make and create. Loob, we suggest, can, in its form as may loob, serve as the Tagalog equivalent of the philosophical notion of human person as individualized subject agent of morality. Let's take a closer look at the structure of loob or the human within as revealed by language. The first group of terms that you will find refer to malay. And you may say of a child, pasensyahan na ho ninyo, wala pa hong malay. And this malay does not refer to the child as being unaware or in a faint, but rather of the child being unaware of the distinctions between good and evil and right and wrong and so on. Therefore, not a simple description, but also an evaluative description of consciousness. Another element in loob is dama. And dama can be seen in its various forms as feelings or sensations or desires. And desires can be distinguished into wants and needs. But pakikiramdam is basically the capacity to feel at all. Whereas dama, mga damdamin, are the individual feelings or emotions that we experience, such as anger, such as hate, such as love, such as tenderness, and so forth. Another type or element in loob is ugali. And it is the type of, or the manner, or the characteristic form of behaving, or the volitive dimension in human personality that one is born with as a product of one's genes. It's not something that you can construct at will, but it is something that you simply recognize and submit to and accept. A quick example of that is when, for example, everybody is asleep and somebody wakes up and goes to the bathroom. And without anyone identifying who that is, you know who that is because of the particular form of behavior. These three characterize in a particular form or in a more salient way the construct that we call psychological personality. In other words, that is who you are as a product of nature, of biology, and of genes. There's a second set of concepts which belong to loob. One is isip, and clearly this refers to thought, intelligence, and reasoning, or in philosophical terms, what they called the mind, and from there went into other forms like the spirit and so forth. The most complicated and complex element with regard to human ethics is bait. And bait can be classified in a certain way, in a popular way, as your gut sense of goodness, your visceral goodness. And you look at it as innate goodness, as something that you were born with as a human being, something that you evolve almost connaturally, as the philosophers would say. It can also be critical bait. And this is when, for example, you react in a negative way when you see even an animal being maltreated because you feel that this is not the humane way of behaving. Laban sa bait, hindi mabait. And bait can also be the practical bait, in the practical sense of being able to determine what is appropriate in a particular situation given the interaction of the persons involved. You do not behave in the same way to a child as you would with an adult when it comes to issues of responsibility. And finally, there is a return of the term loob. And here, this is no longer the genotypal will, but this is what we might call the will as agent. It is an indicative will. It is how the will pursues certain objectives. It is imperative in the sense of the self dictating to oneself what it must do. And it is also the loob as kalooban, which, when faced with different options, chooses a particular decision. Linguistically, loob goes beyond dynamic translation, and we may even consider it as the Tagalog semantic primitive for the notion of person, itself the Greek lexicalization of the idea of individuating activity. In the first stages of trying to determine what personality consisted of, they focused eventually on the notion of a continuing identity. And they borrowed a term from Greek drama, where at that time only males were allowed to perform. And they performed all the different dramatis personae. And how did you distinguish them? You distinguish them not only in their manner, not only in the change of voice, but because they changed masks. So that mask was indicative of that particular personality that was speaking. That person eventually became a shortcut and stood for the concept of person. Anthropologically, loob thickens the description of persons through its lexical branchings, and we already described that. As philosophical anthropology, loob renders the Western discussion on person as subject culturally accessible. It provides counterpart elements of mind, heart, and will in lexical pairings by domain. Namely, for example, when you talk about the rational, you talk of a continuum between malay and isip. Hindi ka maaaring mag-isip kung hindi mo unang matatanggap ito sa malay. And in fact, in psychology, they can determine that malay is even more comprehensive than isip, because through hypnosis, you are allowed, or you can be made to remember things that registered in your consciousness that you were not aware of at that time. Because the function of isip precisely is to select and to combine so that you can arrive at certain conclusions. Malay is like a computer, and computer that is WYSIWYG, or garbage in, garbage out. It just accepts everything without discrimination. But if you are going to access its contents, then you must be able to access it via a code, and that would be equivalent of isip. For the rational then, we have the pairing of malay and isip. The character building on the personality. On the affective side, you have dama. And dama is simply registering your natural responses, your feelings with regard to phenomena and to persons. You're attracted to certain things. You're attracted to certain persons. And there is nothing there that you can control. And sometimes we joke about this, pero minamahal kita. Hindi naman kita pwedeng mahalin. Bakit? May asawa ka na. Or even in the song, John's in love with Joan, Joan's in love with Jim, Jim's in love with someone who's not in love with him. But they cannot control themselves because emotions are what make you who you are as a reactive personality. But not all emotions are acceptable. And there is a controlling sense in us, which we call bait, which can determine what are acceptable and not acceptable emotions, or at least emotions that may be expressed or must be suppressed. And that is bait. And that is what you see in child rearing practices. When a child spontaneously reacts, bakit mo sinampal? Kasi siya hindi yun mabait. It's something that eventually the child begins to understand by reasoning, kasi kung ikaw naman ang sinampal, gusto mo? Ayoko. And then the child begins to understand the distinction of good and right, not in abstraction, but rather in interaction, which is why the concept pakikipagkapwa is so critical. It is through pakikipagkapwa that we arrive at an intuition that eventually we rationalize in more formal, abstract, and logical terms as our moral compass, because that is what bait is. Finally, as you will be able to see, ugali and loob constitute a continuum by itself, and that is devolutional. Because like dama and bait, we have our characteristic forms of reaction, which we put under our control. For example, there are certain things that we like to do, like eating. No? There are certain foods that are presented to us, and which we desire, but which we decline because hindi yun na pwede kasi diabetico ako, bawal na sa akin ang ice cream. And that is where you see that the genotypal will yields to the moral will. That is the dynamic, the volitional dimension between ugali and kalooban. Once we understand that, we begin to understand as well the levels of discourse that ethicists make when they distinguish the pre-moral, the moral, and the ethical. The pre-moral is the intuitive dimension or level, which we do not rationalize or justify or even conceptualize. The moral is when we start providing reasons, but very often those first order or spontaneous reasons come not from our critical senses, but rather as received from the cultures that we are part of. Okay? Ethical is when we are able to stand back from the pre-moral and the moral discourses in order to analytically sort out those that are truly humanizing and those that are not humanizing according to the various polarities that we already discussed as good, bad, proper, improper, decent, indecent, and so on. And so the local language distinguishes between gawa, and here you can use you can look at the phenomenon of killing. Gawa, may pinatay, from kilos, which is itself adjudged as fully responsibly voluntary, pumatay, or nonetheless accountable even if involuntary, nakapatay. For example, before you drive, you go around your car and survey. And then you start the car. But at a particular point, you did not see that a child was playing with a ball, the ball had gone under the car, and you drove. Where is the human responsibility? Where is the moral responsibility? May namatay. Sa makatwid, may pumatay. Pero ito ba ay pinatay? Hindi. Paano mo ngayon sasabihin na may namatay na hindi ikaw ang pumatay? Nakapatay. So, the moral judgment is already embedded in the language. And therefore, there is an ethicam Filipino that is already seen in the form of the language itself, even if it has not been explicitly drawn out in syllogistic reasoning. But if you pay attention to the nuances, then that too is where you can see the correlation between kusang loob, at sadya. The contrast between character or acting ethics versus the deed or doing ethics is reflected differently by the language in the example that we have just given. But it's also the same distinction that is made in a general way between the legal and the moral responsibility. You may be legally responsible even if you are not morally responsible, but you may be morally responsible even if you are not legally responsible. Because one has to do with objective activity and one has to do with subjective responsibility. It even illuminates the distinctive configurations of loob, such as psychological personality, moral character, and I would argue even religious identity, because externally nothing changes if you change your religion, but what changes is what is inside you, your loob. And so you can become either a saint or a sinner tomorrow. You can turn from criminality into a law enforcer, depending on the dynamics and the choices you make in your loob. That is entirely within. So you begin to understand the criteria for moral conscience established in the past, such as honesty, correctness, and certitude. For action to be moral, it must be honest, it must be sincere, the motives must be pure. Not only that, the action must itself be correct. And finally, you must be certain of the action. And this certitude that we are talking about is not scientific certitude as 1 + 1 = 2. We are talking about moral certitude in the sense of you know that these are the values which are involved and the one that you are choosing is the appropriate value to choose. In fact, when we talk about moral certitude in the Filipino sense, we have an expression for it, and that is buo ang loob, which signifies that we have already arrived at the decision, honestly, tapat, that we have determined that it is the correct way of proceeding to it, and that we are certain that this is the way to proceed. In the classical tradition, and even in contemporary times, problematic situations were resolved, particularly when you had to choose between bad and bad effects, with what you call the principle of double effect. Not to act would be immoral, but to act would also be immoral. But since you are not allowed to choose evil directly, to will it directly, then how do you proceed? Because you still have to direct your will. And so, the classical solution to this, which is still practiced today, is to employ what they call the direct involuntary. And trying to explain that to ordinary people becomes extremely complicated, so that in the end, the guidance becomes simply prescriptive. Basta sundin mo na, kasi napag-aralan na namin yan. But if you look at it from the point of view of the notions of sadya, kusang loob at kusa, then you find na meron kang ginagawa na hindi mo sinasadya, pero labag sa iyong loob. Labag sa loob, hindi sinasadya. Pero ginawa sa makatwid kusa is what the indirect, voluntary is all about. At religious levels, it clarifies concepts like conversion or virtue as it is not what goes into loob, but what comes out of loob that defiles a person. That is the classical tradition. In contemporary ethics, certain acts which are considered as intrinsically evil, like lying, murder, contraception, organ transplant, torture, etc., are an indivisible combination of purposive object, something that you desire and you intend to achieve, and subjective intention, which you appropriate in your willing. And this is crucial to determining intrinsically evil actions. Today, what the contemporary philosophers are trying to do is to separate one from the other. And yet, there is no clear distinction or tool by which to do that. The Pinoy moral ethics focuses on intentionality. Ano ba ang niloloob mo? Implying the contrast between act ethics and character ethics, or distinguishing actual event from implied intent, or judgment on act versus judgment on character. Let me give you a couple examples in order to illustrate this elusive concept. A housekeeper is cleaning the house and something precious breaks. There is an argument. I say, bakit mo binasag? Hindi ko po binasag. Nabasag po. Anong nabasag? Paano nabasag? Nabasag ng kusa. Binasag mo. Kasi hindi ko po binasag. Nabasag po. Or take another illustration. Somebody comes to the office and says, sabihan ng register. Ma'am, absent po kayo nung kuwan? Hindi ako nag-absent Dinala ko yung aking anak sa ospital. No? Pero hindi kayo pumasok. Hindi nga ako pumasok, pero hindi ako absent. Ano ba nangyayari dito? What is happening here? Hinuli yung driver ng jeep. Dadahilan niya, naghahanap buhay lang po kami. No? Lumabag ka ng batas No? Hindi ko naman sinasadya. Hindi naman niya sasabihin hindi niya sinasadya. Dahil sinadya niya. Alam niyang sinadya niya. Pero magdadahilan siya. Naghahanap buhay lang po. No? O kaya, you saw the movie, no? Okay? Walang personalan. Trabaho lamang. No? Through these indications, you are seeing a distinction being made between personality and character. Hindi po ako masamang tao. Nagkasala lamang. Look, in our prison apostolate, inquire in any prison context, and no one will admit na siya ay masamang tao. Kahit nakapatay, kahit pumatay, nakapatay lang ako. Hindi po ako masamang tao. Through these examples, you can see how even in ordinary behavior and in moral analysis, moral justification, a distinction is being made between makataong loob at masamang loob dahil hindi makatao. Kung gaano kahiwaga ang loob, kumisan nakikilala pati ng pangkaraniwang tao. Ang kanilang kasabihan, ang taong walang kibo, nasa loob ang kulo. Maraming salamat po sa inyong pakikinig.